Here's something that catches most people off guard. Under GDPR, failing to conduct a DPIA when one is required can cost an organization up to 10 million euros or 2% of global turnover. And yet, studies show a large share of companies still skip them or treat them as a tick box exercise. Think about that for a second. A tool that exists to protect people is often the very thing organizations rush through. So, what are you going to walk away with here? In this chapter, in just a few minutes, you'll understand exactly what a DPIA is, why regulators care so deeply about it, and where it fits within GDPR and privacy laws around the world. We'll clear up the confusion between a DPIA and a regular risk assessment. Look at what counts as high risk processing and see what supervisory authorities actually expect. By the end, you'll see the DPIA not as paperwork but as a genuine safeguard. Let's begin. Let me start by telling you what we're really building together here. This isn't just a series of videos on a compliance topic. Think of it as a complete hands-on journey where by the end you'll be able to run a data protection impact assessment from scratch confidently on a real project. So what's the plan? We'll move through this step by step. First, we'll understand what a DPIA is and when the law demands one. Then we'll walk through the actual life cycle, scoping a project, mapping how data flows, assessing whether the processing is truly necessary, identifying the risks, and finally designing controls to bring those risks down. And we'll wrap up with a real case study that ties everything together. Here's why I've structured it this way. When I train privacy teams, I notice people can define a DPIA perfectly but freeze the moment they face a live project. My goal is different. I want you to finish this playlist and think, I could actually do this on Monday. So keep a notepad handy, follow along in order, and let's make privacy something you practice, not just recite. So let's get to the heart of it. What actually is a DPIA? The official line is that it's a process to identify and minimize the data protection risks of a project. That's accurate, but let's break it down in simpler words. Imagine you're about to launch something new, a mobile app, a hiring tool, a customer database. Before you switch it on, you pause and ask, could this harm the people whose data we are using? And if so, how do we reduce that harm? That structured pause is a DPIA. Think of it like a building inspection before you let people move in. You wouldn't hand over keys to a new apartment without checking the wiring and the foundations. A DPIA is that inspection, but for personal data. Here's a quick story. On a project for a retail client, the team wanted to roll out facial recognition at store entrances. It sounded innovative. But running a DPIA early surfaced serious risks around consent and bias, and we redesigned the whole approach before a single camera went live. That's the power of doing this upfront. It's not about slowing you down, it's about spotting problems while they are still cheap and easy to fix. Now here's where a lot of people get tangled up. They assume a DPIA is just another risk assessment with a fancier name. So let's clear that confusion because the distinction really matters. A general risk assessment usually asks, what's the risk to the organization? Things like financial loss, downtime, reputational damage. A DPIA flips that lens. It asks, what's the risk to the individual? To their privacy, their rights, their freedoms. Same discipline, different subject at the center. Can you see how that shift changes everything you look at? Let me give you a real example. A security team once told me their new monitoring system was low risk because it was well protected and unlikely to be breached. From a security view, fair enough. But from a DPIA view, the system quietly tracked employees all day, and that raised a real risk to their privacy regardless of how secure it was. Two completely different conclusions from the same system. And that leads to the biggest misconception of all, that a DPIA is a one-time form you fill and forget. It isn't. It's a living process that evolves as your project does. Hold on to that idea, because it shapes everything we'll cover next. Let's talk about where this actually comes from in law, because that's what gives a DPIA its teeth. Under GDPR, this lives in Article 35. In plain terms, when a type of processing is likely to result in a high risk to people's rights and freedoms, you're legally required to carry out a DPIA before you start. Notice that word before. This is meant to happen at the design stage, not as an afterthought once everything's already live. So, what does the law expect you to actually do? Four things really: describe the processing and why you're doing it, assess whether it's necessary and proportionate, evaluate the risks to individuals, and then set out the measures you'll use to address those risks. Here's a scenario to make it concrete. Imagine a bank building an AI model to score loan applications using huge amounts of personal and financial data. That's high risk written all over it. So GDPR says a DPIA isn't optional. Skipping it isn't just poor practice, it's a breach in itself. And here's why this matters for you. Understanding the legal trigger is what separates teams who react to regulators from teams who stay ahead of them. Now, GDPR gets most of the spotlight, but here's something worth pausing on. The idea of assessing privacy impact isn't a European invention that stops at Europe's borders. It's gone global, and if you operate across regions, you need to see the bigger picture. Take India's Digital Personal Data Protection Framework, which is pushing organizations toward accountability and risk-based thinking, or Brazil's LGPD, which echoes GDPR closely and expects impact reporting for higher risk processing. In the United States, laws in states like California are steering companies toward risk assessments for sensitive data and profiling. Different names, similar spirit. Let me share a practical reality. When I worked with a client operating across Europe, India, and the US, we didn't build three separate assessments. We built one strong GDPR-grade DPIA process and adapted it to each region's nuances. Why reinvent the wheel 5 times? So here's the takeaway I want you to hold. If you master the DPIA properly, you're not just solving for one law, you're building a skill that travels with you across almost every major privacy regime in the world. That's what makes this so valuable. So let's tackle the question everyone eventually asks. What counts as high-risk processing, and what happens if you get this wrong? Because that's really where the pressure comes from. Regulators point to certain patterns that raise the flag. Systematic profiling that affects people significantly. Large-scale use of sensitive data like health or biometrics. Monitoring people in public spaces. Using new or intrusive technologies. When you see these, treat a DPIA as expected, not optional. Ask yourself, does my project touch any of these? If yes, you already have your answer. And the penalties? Under GDPR, failing to conduct a required DPIA can lead to fines up to 10 million euros or 2% of global annual turnover, whichever is higher. But honestly, the fine is rarely the worst part. Think about a healthcare provider that rolls out a patient tracking system without any assessment and it later leaks. The regulatory penalty stings, but the loss of patient trust and the headlines can be far more damaging. So here's why this matters. The DPIA isn't there to punish you. It's the very thing that helps you avoid all of this in the first place. Let's step into the regulator's shoes for a moment, because understanding what they expect changes how you approach this entire process. What does a supervisory authority actually want to see when they look at your DPIA? In short, they want evidence that you thought this through genuinely. Not a template you copied and pasted, but real reasoning. They want to see that you understood the processing, weighed the risks honestly, and took meaningful steps to reduce them. And here's a key one people forget. If your assessment shows a high risk that you can't bring down to an acceptable level, you're expected to consult the authority before you go ahead. That's called prior consultation. Let me give you a sense of what impresses them. On one review, a regulator was far more reassured by a company that openly documented a risk it hadn't fully solved, along with its plan to manage it, than by a rival waving a flawless-looking form that clearly ignored reality. Honesty and rigor win here. So think about that as we go forward. The goal isn't a perfect-looking document, it's a defensible one. If you can explain your thinking clearly, you'll meet their expectations comfortably. Let's pull this chapter together because we've covered real ground. So what should stick with you? First, a DPIA is a structured process to spot and reduce privacy risks before a project goes live. It's a safeguard, not paperwork. Remember that building inspection analogy? Same idea applied to personal data. Second, keep the distinction sharp. A DPIA looks at risk to the individual, while a general risk assessment often looks at risk to the organization. Different lens, different conclusions, as we saw with that employee monitoring example. Third, this is grounded in law. GDPR's Article 35 makes it mandatory for high-risk processing, and similar thinking now runs through privacy laws across India, Brazil, the US, and beyond. Master it once, and you're covered widely. And finally, regulators value genuine, honest reasoning over a polished form. When in doubt about high risk, lean toward doing the DPIA. Hold on to these ideas because in the next chapter we get practical. We'll dig into exactly when a DPIA is triggered and walk through its full life cycle. This is where theory starts turning into real skill.